Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. It is our great pleasure to welcome back best-selling author, professor, lecturer, motivational speaker, music executive, artist manager, entrepreneur, fighter, and cancer survivor, triumphant in many, many ways, none other than Dr. Mathew Knowles. Dr. Knowles, good morning and welcome back to the OPT Network.
Good morning, Carlette. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you. I think this is our third time.
This is our third time.
And each and every time, it's just a real pleasure. I walk away just excited. And so I'm just looking forward to our talk.
Me too. And I want to say off the top, congratulations on your new podcast on iHeartRadio called Impact. I know that it is going to be impactful in so many ways. So we're super excited about the birthing of that new venture. And this morning, I wanted to talk about your book. I had the chance. The book is so tattered because that's how much I have embraced the book. Racism from the Eyes of a Child is one of the books that you had written. And I thought it was so important to revisit this conversation and this book. You wrote the book some years ago, but now racism is being talked about in a different space than ever before. And I thought a lot of people know that you're from Alabama, but really don't know the trauma that you experienced as a young boy. And so the title, Racism from the Eyes of a Child, when I looked at the book and I looked at the title and I wondered, what does that really mean? But you give us a lot of insight on growing up in a very, very segregated Gadsden, Alabama. Talk about why you decided to go back after all the pain and all the trauma. And it looks like, from reading the book that that was a part of your life that you wanted to put in the rearview mirror.
Right. Well, a lot of that came about in years of therapy for the racial trauma. People don't think of racism as trauma, but it is. And it certainly was for me as a child. I start that book out by telling this story of my grandparents lived in a smaller town, Marion, in Alabama. My mother took me and my brother often down there in the summers, and my mother got in an argument with her mother, my grandmother, and we left at 10, 11 o'clock, ill-advised, and went down the dirt road to the highway and was walking to the nearest relative. And in the distance, we could see lights. And then those lights got brighter and we began to hear horns, and the horns got louder. And then finally, my mother grabbed my hand and grabbed my brother and said, "We have to get in the woods. We have to get in the woods now." And as a 5-year-old, you were wondering, why? What is going on? And then as the cars passed by, finally, my mother gets on top and she says, and starts praying and says, "Something happens. Jesse, my older brother, he's 9 years older, take your brother and y'all go up under that barbed wire fence." And there was cows there, and just run as fast as you can. And my mother was really willing to give her life at that moment for her kids. And it was the Ku Klux Klan. It was a caravan. And if they hadn't seen us, who knows what would have happened. It was not uncommon for bad things for people, Black folks and kids, to disappear. So that's why I named the book Racism from the Eyes of a Child, because that was my first day of experiencing at 5 years old the fear and the trauma of racism.
And I think that the book really gives the reader an insight on how you were built, how you grew up, and why you were so driven to achieve such greatness. And one of the things that you talked about was your mother almost being the driving force. Like, she wanted to make sure that you were educated. She wanted to make sure that you stepped into places that it wasn't popular to step into, like going into schools where, there weren't any Black children. Talk about the impact of those type decisions that your mom made for you.
Yeah, my mother was a very strong woman, 5'11". She was a very tall woman, and my family is very tall. She grew up, like I said, in Marion, but went to high school with Coretta King. And so it's very interesting to me that Andrew Young and Coretta King's, Andrew Young's wife and Coretta King, all three went to high school there in Marion, and how they all ended their paths. So when my mother came to Gaston, Alabama, she took the torch of integration and desegregation. I'm a kid, I'm a kid. I'm doing what mothers and dads, whatever they tell me. And so I integrated at a young age, a Catholic school, all things in Gaston, Alabama, then Litchfield Junior High, which was all white, almost 1,000 white kids, and was 6 of us. And then Gaston High, which was about 3,000 kids, and it was about 35 of us. And then University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And a lot of trauma comes with that. A lot of trauma comes with the first days of school and kids laughing and making fun of you. And, I made a mistake. I remember my first day in junior high school, and I was in Mr. Jones. I can remember it because trauma, you remember it like it was yesterday. In his English class, it was a kind white man teacher. And I read a paragraph and I made a mistake. And these kids just started throwing darts and airplanes and laughing. And that just took a lot out of me. I mean, and the fear of not knowing the threats that you were going to get beat up or get killed. My mother even came and took a job in the cafeteria at Litchfield Junior High because she was frightened for my life. Because there's only 6 Black kids there. And what you said is so accurate, Carlette. People don't realize in that first wave, those of us that was in that first wave, we didn't know any day something could happen. The KKK was everywhere. George Wallace was the governor. Al Lingo was over the police. I mean, it was people getting beat and all the time. It was amazing.
It was not safe to be Black, and especially to be Black in a situation where you were put into white schools where you were unwanted. And, as I was reading the book, I said, we look at all of these people as trailblazers and we hold them up, and they are, and you are. But we never really contemplated, I never really contemplated until I read this book, the trauma that the body could hold for all those years, and how that being ostracized and being fearing for your life every day just to be educated, how that could really impact your life as an adult, and how that changes you. And you really talk about it so beautifully in the book.
And there was a period in my therapy that I had to forgive my mother because I had some anger because, I'm 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. And, the question my therapist once asked, would you have wanted to be in those situations now that you're a grown up? And I was like, no, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And I know my mother had all nothing but the best intentions. And she was a very strong woman. I talk about my mother, Helen, quite a bit. And I like the part when I remember a white insurance man, those weekly premiums. And he came knocking on the door. Is Helen here? Is Helen Knowles here? My mother came out. She says, young man, you have 2 choices. You can get your butt back in that car. You can come back out and you can ask if Mrs. Knowles is here. Or you can lapse my policy and leave right now. He got in that car, came back, made a role play, came back, and as Mrs. Knowles here, she was that kind of woman. She was a very strong Black woman.
Absolutely. Let's take a break here, Dr. Knowles. But when we come back, I want to talk about how growing up in such a challenging time really helps to mold and shape the man that you become, the entrepreneur, and to go on and get educated and do so many impactful things in the world. Stay on point. We're back with more right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is Dr. Mathew Knowles. Of course, he's a best-selling author, professor, lecturer, motivational speaker, music executive. And many people, Dr. Knowles, don't know that you went back and you got a PhD. So if your body of work isn't great enough, you're still achieving. I think that speaks volumes to growing up and your mother having such high expectations. You talk about your dad, but you just talk about your dad sort of being this gentle giant, but mom is the driver in the family. And you write in the book, I could never mend the country's racial chaos in this book, but I'm sure I can fix a chaotic part of myself by writing it. And you talk about your own family history, and it feels like you're going back to Gadsden, a place where when you left there, it was kind of clear that you didn't really want to look back on that. Talk about going back and really revisiting the pain that was there.
Yeah, Carlette, when I graduated from high school and went to the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, there was 3 years that I never went back to Gadsden, Alabama. The memories and the emotions of going back there was always troubling for me. My mother, my parents taught me entrepreneurship. If you read that book, you understand that I come from a family history of entrepreneurs. And my dad made $30 a week driving a truck for a produce company. My mom made $15 a week as a colored maid. But what they both did was my dad convinced the owners that he could keep the truck 24 hours a day, and he would tear down houses and sell all of the metals and copper and wood. He would buy old cars and sell all the parts. My mother convinced a white woman she worked for, as well as asked her other white friends to give them any hand-me-down clothes. And my mother on the weekend with her two best girlfriends, they would make these beautiful quilts, and my mother would sell those. So I came from, and they gave me that entrepreneurial spirit. My mother always instilled in me that I could do whatever I desired. Any dream that I had, I could do it with hard work. Now I understand the dream was a passion, and passion coexists with work ethics. I didn't, certainly as a young kid didn't understand that, but those are the principles growing up on a dirt road in Gadsden with an outhouse. And then having an opportunity in life to live the kind of life I've led and to go back to school. And what you don't know is that I went back to Harvard, not went back, but I attended Harvard this summer for ethical leadership course and professional development at Harvard. So I'm constantly wanting to grow. I'm constantly wanting to learn. I don't think that'll ever be something that our change.
You know what was interesting to me, and I really wanted to explore this, after leaving Gadsden and going off to college and making your way, you also made a break from your parents that I thought was really, really interesting. And it was hard. It was hard to read, that you really didn't want them to come, and you didn't want to go back home because there was some shame there. Talk about that.
Yeah, I used to be very shameful that where I grew up, I was ashamed of my parents. My dad was a beast man. My mom, not very educated. And there was a point of anger, though. Deep inside of that was the anger that I had as a child for what I had to go through. And it was so bad because, as you know in the book, in my high school year, when I'm a star athlete, and we played Carver High, which is the black school. All the blacks that night after the game in Gaston High, we beat Carver High, and they rioted. They rioted, turned over cars, and we had to run out of the door to the back of the gym. And some of those same policemen that I had to save me earlier and was there for the white parents the first days of school, was there to save us. And then I was termed and called an Oreo. And I couldn't go to any black parties because if I went to a party, they would want to beat me up. So I would live in this world of isolation. I didn't get invited to any white parties. And so I didn't have, my social life was very, very limited growing up.
And what I found in the book was there was a duality that you were living in. You know, you were living in a mostly white world where you weren't really accepted. And then there's the black world over here that's thinking you've sold the black world out. And so you really don't really fit anywhere. But what I thought, Dr. Knowles, was just really, really big. And I don't think that most people would have the courage to say they were ashamed of their parents. I think it really took a lot of courage to just be open and honest about how you really felt. And it's not that you didn't love them, and it's not that they didn't want the best for you, but it's just how you felt as a young man.
Well, I have the saying, in my vulnerability lies my safety. And by writing that book, it allowed me to let go of that, let go of the shame, let go of the trauma, put it out in the universe. And I talk about a subject that's most people don't even know, eroticized rage, a term that is a therapeutic term that I learned in my years of therapy, and understanding the reverse of that anger was dating white women only and dating them because they were white. There's nothing wrong with dating other cultures and other races. There's nothing wrong with that. But what's wrong is when one say, I only date white women. That's wrong. And for me, it was the rage I had of getting back. And how could I get back to the white race and to the white man was by dating only white women.
And then there was the dynamic of your mother, who also, colorism played a role in that. So it felt like you didn't really know where to be, because your mother sort of turned into, had some color issues, colorism.
Well, I mean, I say it in the book. My mom would always say, it was said many times, don't you ever bring no nappy head woman or girl to this house.
And that's probably the cleaned up version.
Yes, it is.
I didn't want
Good
to say
insight.
it, but you did write it in the book. And I thought, wow.
Yeah, I mean.
How did that make you feel? How did you feel about that?
Well, how I feel today is sad. But that was not just my mother's comments.
Oh, I know.
That was the comments of many, 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 many Black women and mothers during that time in Alabama and other rural states around America, and in major cities.
Absolutely. And it was common. And as hard as it is to sit here and talk about it, if you grew up in a family, you understand colorism. It even exists today, the red one and the black one.
Exactly.
The red one is more favored, even though nobody's saying it, but that's really what we're saying.
That's exactly right. And It's just very sad that I had to experience that others had to experience that. And I'm glad that you allow me this platform to say to all of those people who never get acknowledged the way that they should. Yeah, we've acknowledged once if someone got killed, they got acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
But those of us that had to endure that and had to the duality of, because when you're a child, you spend most of your time in school. You don't spend most of your time at home.
Mm-mm.
You spend most of your time in school. And to understand all of those dynamics, and then something else happened. Then I realized in junior high school, I was tall and skinny, Carlette. I could not play basketball at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true, that's a couple of movies. Well, because I was black, the coach thought, oh, God, he's tall and black. He can play basketball. Well, I couldn't. But he gave me some small exercises and I picked up quickly. But something happened that I realized that the white kids started treating me differently after I played basketball, which made me, I've never said this, I don't know if I really say it in the book, but that really made me focus more on playing basketball because I started to get treated.
Attention. And you talked about it. You talked about it and you said not only did it make you get better, but it made you want to dress better. It made you want to look better.
Yes.
Because you were finally getting that acceptance from people who looked at you and now you had something to offer. And I think the piece with your mom, I've gone back and looked at people talking about that. And I think that it was, as I said earlier, is something that many families, most Black families have dealt with that. And I don't think that that's a big, seminal moment. It's just the way that it was. And it doesn't mean that your mom was in any way bad or doesn't speak to her character. It's just the way that people looked at color, and still colorism exists.
Yeah, absolutely. We just heard recently on an interview with the royalty in London, in England.
And you know what? That didn't surprise me at all.
It didn't either. I don't know why people were surprised. And like, gosh, we're in a world that it still matters to people.
Right.
It still matters outside of our Black community, and it still matters in some parts of the world and the country.
Right.
Louisiana and
That's
Texas. Right. That still matters in Louisiana and Texas.
That's right. It does. In fact, I had a friend that was darker skinned and was dating a lighter skinned boy, and the family wants to protect the color line. They don't want to intermingle a dark person because we don't know what color the children are going to come. That is something that happens in Black families, and people talk about that stuff.
And it still happens today.
It still happens today. Yeah. Let's take a break here. But when we come back, I want to talk about moving forward and moving into the realm of really working hard and understanding that you didn't want to be poor and that you were going to survive and thrive by any means necessary. Dr. Mathew Knowles is our guest this morning, everybody. Stay on point for more of this very interesting conversation right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is Dr. Mathew Knowles. We're talking about his book, his podcast, his success, and all that lies in between all of that. The book is entitled Racism from the Eyes of a Child. And before we went to break, we were just talking about this journey and this trauma. And so after you graduate from college, you know that you are not going to go back home, and a lot of the young men migrate to Texas and are doing well, and you make that leap as well. Talk about the desire to succeed and not have to go back to Gadsden.
Well, I think I look back and I think a lot of that had to do with a couple of things. One, being an athlete and being in competitive sports and understanding team and, experiencing being on championship teams and winning. But when I transferred to Fisk University, I had never been to a Black school until my junior year of college.
And that changes you. Doesn't that change you?
That changes me. And initially, when I got to Fisk, I was literally like a deer in headlights because I saw all these Black people. They were loud and having fun, and I hadn't come from an environment like that. And, I felt out of place. And fortunately, my fraternity, Omega Psi Phi, I had pledged at University of Tennessee. And that really was helpful because I had a bond with some young men. But I felt very much because at Fisk at that time, colorism was a big thing. I was in the last class of the paper bag, the brown paper bag, which you had to take a photo and they would put it next to a brown bag. And so I was much darker than 95% of the students. Most of us, my complexion were either athletes or from the Caribbean, where huge donations have been given, or a few students from America, like Hank Aaron's daughter, where huge donations had been given. So it was a totally different. And at Fisk, if you weren't smart, the girls didn't like you. Being an athlete was a negative. Nobody cared that you were.
But before we talk about Fisk, I want to talk about the trauma of having to transfer and why you had to transfer. Because I think all of that adds to, it's like, adding, layers and layers of pain. Talk about why you left and why you had to transfer.
When I first got to University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, we were given roommates in the athletic dorm. I was a freshman. My roommate was a junior at that time. In my sophomore year, I then got to play in the varsity, and he was a senior then. And so I was challenging him for his position on the team. But I was dating a young lady that was very fair complexion. And during the holidays, most of the Black athletes, we stayed there. I didn't want to go home. You already know my relationship with Gaston. So I stayed on campus, and my girlfriend came, and it was pretty, with young people, the guys would bang on your door and, just silly stuff. But I got a different knock on the door, and I thought it was one of my fellow teammates, but it was the coach. And when he opened the door, he looked and he thought she was white. And he said two things. If I was you, I would get her out of here now. And I want to see your butt. Didn't quite use those kind of gentle words, but I want to see you in my office in the morning. And when I got there, he was telling me a word I didn't even know, something about social. You can get expelled for some social expel. I had a word for it. And I couldn't go to any colleges or universities because of that. So I got kicked out of University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And fortunately, we had scrimmaged Fisk University. But I got kicked out because this coach thought this was a white woman I had. And it wasn't, but
all these things that happen, and you're a boy, 5 years old, and you have your first brush with the Ku Klux Klan with your mom and your brother, and then you go to all white schools, and then all of these series of events happen in your life, and then when you go off to college and you get thrown out of the university and you're on your own. And I'm wondering, how are you navigating all of these things and, not connecting with your family or having the support system to try to keep you on the right path. But, you manage it. How does that happen?
Well, I just, if, in the book I talk about, I worked all my life. I always had a job.
Right.
I had a job.
But your mental well-being, because now you're having both groups come, the white group, not necessarily good enough for the white group, not good enough for the black group. You get put out of your school, then you got to go start over with the black group who you were never really accepted, and you got to find your place there. And so I'm wondering, how all this plays on your psyche as a young man.
Well, it certainly plays on that. Absolutely, it does. I was merely saying that what made it somewhat better is that financially I had some stability. Financially, because I had jobs all the time. I worked very hard. And so I didn't go astray. I think that helped me from going astray. Just the fact that I had discipline of going to work daily and not the owl time of then getting into trouble and making bad decisions.
Do you become a workaholic early?
Yes, I do. That's very good. You picked up on that.
Yeah, you can feel it because you talk about working and always working, and you come from workers. I mean, you see your folks working, but it feels like the work is something that helps you to show up in life.
Well, and when you work that hard, anything that you do in excess is because you're wanting to mask or hide what's deep inside and the feelings inside. And certainly, there was a time where I used work to mask. There was a time I used alcohol to mask. There was a time that I used sex to mask.
And you write about that in the book.
Yeah, I write about that. And that got me in trouble with my marriage, got me in trouble with family. When I masked it, that's when it connected that it was all about this racial trauma, all about trying to show to the world and not having hearing those messages that I heard when I was a small child.
Of not being enough, not being good enough.
Not being enough.
Hold that thought. Let's take a break here, but when we come back, we'll have more of our conversation with Dr. Mathew Knowles. Stay on point. We're back right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is no stranger to the OPT Network now, Dr. Mathew Knowles. He has written just incredible books. How many books, Dr. Knowles, have you published?
6 now.
6
that
books.
I've written.
And I think that Racism from the Eyes of a Child, it really tells us about the beginning. And it tells us how you go through this life and how we all really show up. One of the last times we talked about therapy being such an important piece. And we can understand from the book why you've been driven to succeed. It's almost like failure is not an option. And your mom seemed to be very driven in that way as well.
She was. Failure was never an option, and there was a price to pay if there was failure. And then when you look even into my grandparents, failure was not an option. And everybody just always was working.
And so, I started thinking about your grandparents and your parents, especially the matriarchs in your family. And you took on that work ethic and that succeed at whatever cost. You're going to succeed. Do you then pass that on to your girls? Because you talked about that stringence. Do you have that same mentality with them?
I think it was passed on to them by me. We talk about it all the time to pull back. I think they're beginning to understand that. But for me, I love, Carlette, I'm looking down because I'm looking at my schedule, And where there was a time I might have 10 to 12 things to do, I actually now from 2 o'clock to 4 take a 2-hour break every day. And I never, even in corporate America, I never took lunch or seldom took a lunch. I would always eat at my desk. But I've learned to just cut back tremendously and enjoy life. Every Sunday I put up on my Instagram, I put up a sunset. I take photos of the sunset now. Things that I never would do. I would never look at the beauty. I used to say, wow, when people say they're looking at the sunset and looking at trees, like, what the hell are they looking at? It seems so boring, like a waste of time. But now I see the beauty and understand that it's the end of a day. We'll never get to live that day again. We see a sunset.
Were you able to forgive your mom for pushing so hard?
Absolutely. It took a while, but I certainly was able to forgive her and to forget.
And so tell us about the podcast and what your hopes are for your next.
Well, I'm really enjoying, and it's called Mathew Knowles Impact on iHeart Radio. But it gives me a platform to talk about 4 things. Racism, and that's underlining in most of all the segments. Entrepreneurship. There is some music business, but very little. And health and wellness. I started out with Al Sharpton. There's a Jesse Lee Peterson episode of a Black man who thinks racism doesn't exist in America. There's an episode of a white woman who moved quickly in a corporation, who never went to college and then became president of a $2 billion company, and comparing that, would that ever be equitable and attainable for a Black female in America today? It's interesting we're talking about colorism because I'm interviewing tomorrow on colorism, but it gives me a platform to share and to get feedback because I have callers that call in, but to use a platform to talk about what I consider very important topics that really comes from lack of education in our Black community. Because if you're not educated, then you'll probably have a job that is not paying well. And if you're not educated and have a job that's not paying well, you probably have poor living conditions. And if you're not educated and living in poor living conditions, you probably have poor health. So it all comes from a lack of education and knowledge.
And what about mentorship? You're molding and shaping young minds. Where do you see that going, helping and mentoring the next generation?
Well, most people don't realize this. This is my 15th year, 30 semesters as a college professor. Right now, I teach at University of Houston. I teach at Prairie View A&M, which is a HBCU, and I teach at the Art Institute. That's currently as I sit here. And so that's something that I love and passionate. And I announced I'm leaving the music industry. I will continue to on the business side and on the creative side of development. But record label management, I'm done with that. It was a great run for me. My focus now is I have some film and TV projects. One is Racism from the Eyes of a Child that we're writing the script right now. I'll focus on those for the next 2 years, and then my single focus will be just on a podcast, lecturing, and public speaking and motivating.
Amazing. Dr. Knowles, as always, insightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. And we know that whatever it is that you do, you're going to be all in. It's going to be done with a spirit of excellence, and it's going to be a blessing to the world. Thank you so much.
So guess what I work on, number one, every day?
What's that?
I work on happiness. I never put the same effort and being happy as I did in my jobs and accomplishments. So my number one thing today is to work on happiness.
That's awesome. Dr. Knowles, thank you so much. I look forward to many, 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 many conversations.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Indeed. Hey, everybody, Dr. Mathew Knowles has been our guest. Stay on point. We're back right after this.